All right, hi, I am Jeremy Feinberg. I am a postdoctoral researcher in the James Smithson Fellowship Program, and I split my time equally between natural history in the Division of Amphibians and Reptiles in VZ and at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute through the National Zoo. And so the talk that I'm going to be giving is about my work on frogs, and with a special focus on the recently discovered leopard frog that was found in New York City a couple years back. So I do a lot of my work in urban systems, and I think people typically envision this when they think of me out in the field, but the sites I actually work on look a little bit more like this. They're still in the urban systems, but they have a bit of viable habitat, and this is the New York City skyline, so just to get some perspective that there are habitats that close to the World Trade Center. And so my interest was in two leopard frog species, sort of at their confluence in the New York City area. To the north you have in the green the northern leopard frog, Rana or Lithobates pipiens, and to the south in the red areas you have the southern leopard frog, Rana or Lithobates spinocephala. And I was interested in why they vanished from Long Island in the last 15, 20 years. Specifically, the southern leopard frog was the frog that was thought to be on Long Island. And so in doing my research, I would go out into the field and collect eggs from extant mainland populations and bring them out to extinction wetlands and raise them as young tadpoles in enclosures in these extinction ponds on Long Island. And in doing that, I initially started by drawing southern leopard frog eggs in central New Jersey, and at some point in the middle of my work, I found out about a surviving population on Staten Island, of all places, and started drawing eggs from there as well to bring out to my experimental sites out in the extinction zone on Long Island. And in doing that, the Staten Island frogs in particular started to have certain signatures that were unusual. In terms of just, in addition to just looking bizarre to those who know leopard frogs, I would be out at the site and listen at their calls, and they were extremely different from what we expected and from what the call of the southern leopard frog should be. And over time and research, we learned that these frogs on Staten Island, as well as some other areas in the New York City region, as well as a bunch of locations up and down the East Coast from Connecticut all the way to North Carolina, were actually a hidden species, a cryptic species we call them, that we now call the Atlantic coast leopard frog, Rana caulfieldi. And we looked at the frog using both molecular data and their bioacoustics, their very distinct call signatures. And here's the new species, and you can see its call is represented in a waveform there, and you can see it's very different from the one we all thought it was. So cryptic species are difficult to work with, and I think it's helpful to kind of to have a graphic like this. All three of the leopard frogs on the East Coast are represented in this photo. Typically, I think we're visual creatures. We define what we think might be the species pairs here, but when you reveal who's who, you can see that this goes well beyond the way that they look, and it makes it difficult to work on them, but there are tools, including molecular and bioacoustics. So here was the range that we started off with, and here's where things kind of ended up after we figured out that there was a third hidden species in this very populated metropolitan area and beyond. And so the purple is where we've basically replaced the southern leopard frog with this new species. And down here in the yellow regions, we actually now know that there are both the southern and the new species occurring together. So this creates a lot of questions and things to consider when you're talking about these hidden species. One question in this particular case is, how did this species remain hidden in places like New York, Philadelphia, Wilmington, even Newark? You could literally see some of these sites out the windows of the buildings in these cities. And if these cryptic species are hiding out, especially in places like this, could they be rare, endangered, and in need of protection? In terms of the scientific literature, this can destabilize all the literature based on the original species before we realize it was multiple species. And so that really can be mind-blowing, especially for something like Rana pipiens, one of the most studied frogs in history. With this new frog, we also now know that it has a very lowland range right along the I-95 corridor, where climate change is certainly a concern, and flooding and sea level rise. And in the end, this discovery, for instance, didn't impact just the new species, but it had impacts on all three species by just changing their range and changing considerations at the different state levels. And so the question is, does this happen often? Well, it probably happens a lot more often than you think in places in the tropics and in remote areas. But in urban areas and places like the US, we've only had 2 brand new frog species totally unknown to science in the last 30 years. And in terms of an amphibian discovered from the state of New York, this was the first since 1854, so not common. And if this cryptic diversity was able to exist in a place like New York, what else might be out there beyond the Eastern Range? And so that's what I'm doing now. I'm looking at both bioacoustic and museum specimens to see and explore areas where we're finding irresolution in other places, and also on the conservation side of things, looking at how these populations in urban areas, their acoustics might differ from sister populations in rural areas. And so this is a map of a bunch of recording sites all along the eastern US where we currently have recorders in red at urban sites in these major cities, and then the black sites are the rural sites, simultaneously recording each night, and we're going to look and ask a whole bunch of questions about how the calls differ between the two system types. And a lot of people to thank for all this work. And if there are any questions, I'll take them.
Color patterns don't seem to be very useful in identifying the species. What about the bioacoustics in general?
Yeah, so what we're finding is that bioacoustics are, with frogs, it's a great tool. They're really ironclad. They can't necessarily give you detection of different lineages that might be occurring within species, but to identify at the species level, they're really useful. And so I'm able to go out and in the field, just on the fly, kind of identify what's happening where without having to actually get tissues and sample to at least get some clue and point us in the right direction. A great question. So the question is the new species, does it appear to be more adapted or tolerant of urban environments? Right now I can only really speculate, but we are finding it in these urban enclaves that while from a frog perspective they still have certain attributes that we would expect in healthier systems, these places have been impacted hard. The New Jersey Meadowlands, Staten Island, Philadelphia, it's right, but the site that we're currently recording at is right between I-95, Amtrak, and the airport. And the land use history in these locations is incredible. And the land and the landscapes have been adjusted and manipulated and certainly contaminated over time. But when you get out and look at the actual sites today, the signature that you see that suggests that they've definitely been impacted, vegetation is dominated by things like Phragmites, but when you look at the water, it's always clear water, and there are odonates and a lot of other things in these systems that give us hope that in urban systems they have some resilience, and these frogs are probably tolerant, but the systems are also not total apocalyptic landscapes, in other words. Broadly speaking and generally, I'm sorry, so the question was, do the frogs have accents regionally or geographically? And so to answer that, broadly and generally, they tend to be very stereotyped within species. That's not to say that there aren't examples, especially where two similar species will come closer together, that their calls will tend to separate more dramatically than they would in isolation. And factors like temperature, body size can affect the attributes of the calls. But in terms of true, like we see with birds or mammals, regional dialects, the frogs don't seem to have that intelligence to learn and pick up and have sort of, specialized calls in certain areas.